Spain in the waning decades of the 15th century was a land of contrasts, dazzling triumphs and dark intrigue, fervent devotion and relentless ambition, castles of gold shadowed by secrets of blood and betrayal. Castile, one of its most powerful kingdoms, stood at a precarious intersection of dynastic aspiration and religious tension, a realm where the ambitions of rulers and nobles often collided with devastating consequences. To understand the life of the girl who would later be betrothed at the age of 7, one must first enter these gilded halls and shadowed corridors where power demanded cruelty and innocence could vanish like morning mist. The court of Castile was a labyrinth of intrigue. Nobles maneuvered like predators in a gilded cage, each step measured, each word weighed for advantage. Spies roamed the corridors, concealing eyes behind tapestries, eavesdropping on whispered schemes. Every smile concealed calculation, every gesture might mask betrayal. Loyalty was transient, trust a dangerous luxury. In such an environment, even the smallest misstep could mean humiliation or death. A child born into privilege was not shielded from this treacherous reality. She was, instead, placed directly in its path. Child marriages were the most potent instruments of dynastic strategy, and Castile was a kingdom where they were wielded without hesitation. 7-year-old daughters became pawns in a game dictated by ambition, alliances, and the relentless pursuit of power. Their consent was irrelevant, their desires irrelevant, their bodies, their futures, and their very identities were subordinated to political expediency. The young bride, her hands barely able to grasp a goblet, would soon be called upon to embody peace treaties, secure alliances, and legitimize claims to thrones. In the hands of cunning rulers and ruthless nobles, a child could become a symbol of power and a victim of human cruelty. Religion, too, shaped the court's atmosphere. Castile, fiercely Catholic, was gripped by fervor and suspicion, a kingdom recently unified under Ferdinand and Isabella, yet haunted by centuries of conflict and the memory of Muslim and Jewish kingdoms. Religious devotion was inseparable from politics, and the enforcement of orthodoxy often came at the cost of mercy. A child entering the royal court would witness rituals of piety intertwined with the merciless calculus of power, a lesson that faith, like family, could be wielded as both shield and weapon. Into this world of shadows and splendor arrived our young protagonist. Born to noble blood, she was granted wealth, tutors, and the best prospects her family could secure. Yet every advantage came with a price: the perpetual gaze of court, the knowledge that her worth was measured in alliances and marital transactions, the looming reality that her body and soul were considered instruments of policy. She learned, from the earliest days, that life at court was a delicate dance where beauty, wit, and obedience could be exploited, and where fear and cruelty were not anomalies but constants. Gilded halls concealed dangers as much as they dazzled the eye. Banquets, tournaments, and ceremonial occasions offered lessons in observation, the subtle inflection of a whisper, the fleeting glance of a rival, the veiled threats hidden in seemingly polite conversation. The child, though innocent, became a silent witness to the architecture of manipulation that underpinned the court's power. Every gesture of affection or approval carried weight, every reprimand, every slight, echoed with meaning. In these shadows she began to understand the precarious balance of survival, a balance that would demand cunning, patience, and resilience beyond her years. Power in Castile was a currency of its own, measured in lands, titles, and often cruelty. Nobles asserted dominance through intimidation, rumor, and sometimes violence. Rulers maintained control by bending law and tradition to serve dynastic goals. For a child destined to become a bride of the realm, these lessons were neither abstract nor optional. She would quickly grasp that survival in this world required observation, discretion, and an ability to conceal fear beneath a mask of decorum. Her formative years, once meant for innocence and play, were now an initiation into a theatre of political calculation. The human cost of this system was staggering. Children betrothed as instruments of policy often endured emotional isolation, the suppression of natural impulses, and the early surrender of autonomy. Their formative experiences were defined by obligation, surveillance, and the constant pressure to perform roles designed by others. In the Castilian court, childhood was fleeting. Identity was negotiable. Survival depended not on innocence, but on learning to read the intentions of those who wielded power with unflinching ruthlessness. It is here, in the crucible of ambition and intrigue, that the story truly begins. The girl who would become the abandoned bride of Castile was thrust into a world where shadows loomed larger than light, where gilded surfaces masked treachery, and where the tender expectations of childhood collided violently with the unforgiving machinery of dynastic politics. Her tale is one of stolen innocence, human suffering, and the forging of resilience in the face of relentless cruelty. As the Kingdom of Castile prepared for alliances, marriages, and conflicts that would shape Spain's destiny, she waited at the periphery, a child whose life had already been meticulously calculated for her by others. Her story is emblematic of a time when human Offering was often subordinated to ambition, when survival demanded vigilance, and when cruelty was a tool as necessary as diplomacy. The shadowed corridors of Castile's court would become her first battlefield, the lessons learned there shaping every choice, every gesture, and every heartbeat in the years to come. In this somber cinematic frame, we see the stakes, a kingdom poised on the knife's edge of ambition and fear, a child caught in the machinery of dynastic design, and a world in which power demanded cruelty, and innocence was the first casualty. The story of the abandoned bride of Castile is not merely a chronicle of historical events, it is a meditation on identity lost, trauma endured, and resilience forged in the shadows of human ambition. The stage is set, the queen, the court, the kingdom, all awaiting, and the child, poised between fear and destiny, steps unknowingly into a story that will demand survival at every turn, resilience beyond her years, and the quiet mastery of a world that would test her in ways few could endure. She was born into opulence, a child cradled in the gilded corridors of privilege, yet the luxury around her could not shield her from the invisible chains of expectation. From the very first breath, she was marked as a vessel for ambition, a living instrument in a kingdom where alliances were forged on paper and innocence held little value. Her cradle, adorned with silks and embroidered insignias, was not merely a place of comfort, it was the first stage upon which she would play a role dictated by lineage, politics, and power. Her family was powerful, well-connected, and acutely aware of the intricate chessboard that was European royalty. Fathers and uncles, tutors and courtiers, all whispered in careful tones about dynastic opportunities, future marriages, and the alliances that could strengthen or imperil their house. Even in play, she was taught to watch, to note, to remember. A glance, a whisper, a rival's subtle smile could all signal ambition, threat, or favor. From the earliest age, she understood that perception mattered as much as action, and that survival required attention to the smallest gestures. Her upbringing was a paradoxical blend of protection and exposure to danger. Tutors ensured she learned Latin, etiquette, and history, while courtly observers ensured she internalized the unspoken hierarchies that defined her world. Each lesson, each polished skill, was a preparation for a future in which her charm, obedience, and compliance would be evaluated constantly, weighed against the needs of alliance, politics, and power. She learned that her body, her mind, and her presence were commodities, instruments to be wielded for the benefit of her family and the crown. From the earliest days, she was an observer. Even in the midst of games and laughter, she noted the subtle hierarchies among servants, tutors, and visiting nobles. She saw how alliances were formed in fleeting glances, how jealousy simmered beneath polite conversation, and how a carefully chosen word could elevate or destroy a reputation. There was curiosity in her eyes, a hunger for understanding that bordered on precocious. But alongside curiosity was the first stirrings of unease. She sensed that the world she had entered was governed less by fairness than by ambition, manipulation, and sometimes cruelty. Her personality was a mixture of innocence and precocious observation. She was imaginative, able to lose herself in stories and dreams, yet already aware that her imagination might be a luxury too costly in a world where survival depended on vigilance. She could smile and laugh, but she also listened, catalogued, and interpreted the behaviors of those around her. In this tension, between the child she was and the woman she was being groomed to become, lay the earliest seeds of resilience. She learned to hide, to observe, and to internalize knowledge that would serve her later, when she faced the ruthless realities of court. Her childhood, though outwardly one of refinement, was interlaced with subtle forms of psychological pressure. Every compliment could carry expectation, every reprimand might hint at future consequences. Even affection was measured, with love often mediated by political advantage. Her body, though small and delicate, was already seen as a future tool of diplomacy, a marriage to secure peace, a dowry to strengthen alliances, a presence to be displayed, evaluated, and manipulated. The psychological tension this created was profound. She was loved, yet already a commodity, nurtured, yet already under the weight of destiny. Her family, while protective in many ways, could not shield her from the broader realities of political life. Stories of other children betrothed in infancy, of young brides discarded or abandoned, circulated quietly among the corridors and chambers. She heard and she absorbed the unspoken lesson. Beauty, birthright, and compliance might secure favor temporarily, but survival demanded cunning, perception, and the ability to navigate cruelty with subtlety. The Kingdom of Castile taught her that innocence was fleeting and that power, even in its smallest forms, could be both a weapon and a trap. Even at play, she began to practice observation as a skill. She watched the relationships between adults, noting patterns of alliance and rivalry. She understood that gestures, tone, and expression could conceal ambition, threat, or affection. In whispered corners, she overheard adults negotiating, promising, and threatening. In moments of quiet, she felt the weight of the world pressing upon her, the first intimations that her life would be shaped by forces far beyond her control. These early experiences instilled a duality in her character, curiosity mingled with caution, imagination tempered by a nascent understanding of human cruelty. Her tutors, often unaware of the subtle lessons she gleaned, taught her history not as mere facts but as the chronicles of ambition, betrayal, and survival. She learned the stories of rulers who had fallen victim to intrigue, alliances that had collapsed, and young heirs abandoned or manipulated. These tales were warnings as much as education, and she internalized them with a sense of both fascination and fear. In them, she saw reflections of her own life's trajectory, the precarious balance between privilege and peril, between potential and vulnerability. By the time she reached her 7th year, the psychological groundwork for survival had already been laid. She was curious yet cautious, imaginative yet calculating, innocent yet aware of the stakes of her existence. The world had already shown her that children could be used, that alliances were forged on the bodies of the young, and that cruelty was often the currency of power. In this delicate, formative period, she began to understand her role in a drama far larger than herself, a pawn in a kingdom where ambition often demanded human suffering. Her early years were thus a crucible of subtle lessons, observation, patience, discretion, and the ability to read the intentions of those around her. These skills, honed in the gilded halls of privilege yet shadowed by expectation, would become essential in the years to come. She was no longer merely a child. She was a student of power, a young mind learning the rhythms of cruelty and diplomacy, the art of survival in a world where innocence was fleeting and identity could be stripped and reshaped at will. Even in the midst of her limited pleasures, games, music, and whispered confidences, there was a pervasive awareness of being watched, measured, and evaluated. She understood, with a chilling clarity rare for her age, that her future body and mind were already under a negotiation, that her marriage, her behavior, and even her dreams were subject to the ambitions of others. This tension between the child she was and the instrument she was being molded into defined her early life, forging the psychological architecture that would sustain her through the betrayals, abandonments, and cruelties to come. In essence, her early years were not merely the prelude to a historical tale, they were the first battlefield of her life. She learned that observation could be power, that patience could be survival, and that resilience could be forged in the smallest gestures and the quietest moments. Childhood in the court of Castile was never safe, never private, and never free from the machinery of ambition. And yet in this world of gilded shadow and whispered intrigue, the seeds of endurance, cunning, and subtle strength were planted. A young girl preparing unknowingly to face a life where power, cruelty, and human suffering would intersect at every turn. The day arrived with all the trappings of pomp and ceremony, yet beneath the gilded splendor lay a chilling undertone. A child's life had been negotiated, measured, and promised to a man she had never met. At 7 years old, she was led into the heart of the court, her small hands trembling against the folds of her silken gown, her eyes wide with wonder and unspoken fear. The grandeur of the hall, draped with tapestries depicting triumphs of kings long past, could not shield her from the gravity of what was happening. This was not a celebration of youth, it was the transaction of a child's life into the hands of ambition and power. The ruler to whom she had been betrothed was renowned for ruthlessness. His reputation preceded him, a man who wielded authority with an unflinching hand, who measured loyalty against utility, who considered the bodies and futures of women instruments for consolidation of power. To the court, the marriage was a strategic triumph, a bond between families and kingdoms, a calculated alignment of dynastic interests. But to the child, it was an incomprehensible severing from the familiar world of family and play, an abrupt immersion into a life where love, consent, and choice were irrelevant. The ceremony itself was a stark illustration of dynastic ambition. Clerics intoned prayers over her small shoulders, nobles offered ceremonial gifts and gestures of obeisance, and the ruler, imposing and distant, received her with the weight of entitlement. Every act, every word conveyed a clear message. The child was no longer fully her own. She was an asset, a political tool, a symbol of alliance. Her tiny hands, meant for play and exploration, were clasped in symbolic surrender, the first true encounter with the merciless calculus of courtly power. Her confusion and fear were immediate and profound. She could not grasp the full implications of the vows whispered in Latin, the solemn gestures of agreement exchanged by men who spoke in the language of strategy rather than compassion. The faces around her, smiling, approving, applauding, seemed alien and inscrutable. Their warmth, if it existed, was performative, an accompaniment to the larger spectacle of negotiation and control. In that moment, innocence began to fracture, replaced by a dawning awareness that her life would be directed not by her own desires but by the ambitions of others. The psychological impact was subtle but undeniable. She felt the first stirrings of isolation, an acute sense of being set apart from the world of children and normalcy. Her gaze searched for familiar faces, for reassurance, yet found only the cold scrutiny of those invested in the success of the alliance. She learned almost instinctively that her presence was valued only insofar as it served the calculations of power. In this brief, monumental ceremony, the seeds of trauma and identity loss were planted, as she confronted fatigue. The first time the reality that her future body and mind were not her own. The betrothal was more than a single event. It was a formal initiation into a life defined by vigilance and subtle negotiation. Every gesture, the lowering of her gaze, the curtsies she was taught to perform, the precise positioning of her small body, was a lesson in obedience and perception. The court taught her that appearances were paramount, that every movement could be interpreted as strength or weakness, and that survival depended upon the delicate balance of compliance and observation. Her childhood innocence, once natural and unguarded, began to retreat, replaced by a keen awareness of danger lurking behind every courteous smile. Family reactions were mixed, offering both comfort and caution. Her parents, bound by the same ambitions that dictated the marriage, tried to soothe her with gentle words, yet could not mask the strategic triumph in their expressions. They had achieved an alliance that promised power and security, but the price was the surrender of a child's autonomy. Their love, though real, was intertwined with duty, and the child sensed the duality, protection interlaced with obligation, affection shadowed by calculation. Even those who wished her well could not shield her from the stark reality of her position. The court, meanwhile, treated her with a strange combination of reverence and scrutiny. Some nobles viewed her as a mere symbol, a vessel of opportunity to be displayed in public gatherings and ceremonies. Others whispered behind her back, evaluating her for traits of obedience, temperament, or potential influence. In these early encounters, she learned the subtle art of reading people, who might be dangerous, who might offer alliance, and who could be ignored. It was an early, involuntary education in manipulation, deception, and the unspoken hierarchies that would dominate her existence. The betrothal also marked her first encounter with emotional abandonment. The man she was promised would never truly know her, nor could he empathize with a child's confusion or fear. His interests lay in power consolidation, the securing of heirs, and the preservation of authority. She was, for the first time, alone in a space filled with people, expected to perform her role without question, and to internalize the expectation that obedience equaled survival. This was a formative moment, the beginning of an emotional landscape where loneliness and alienation would coexist with the necessity of resilience. Even in the midst of ceremony and splendor, she felt the intangible weight of her new reality. She had been stripped, in a sense, of the agency most children take for granted. The decisions that had shaped her life were made by others, by parents, advisors, and rulers, and she would have to navigate the consequences with intelligence, subtlety, and courage. The betrothal was a crucible, testing not strength of body but fortitude of mind, preparing her for the trials of abandonment, manipulation, and political ruthlessness that lay ahead. Foreshadowing the years to come, the betrothal illustrated the duality of her existence, a life of visibility, yet emotional invisibility, of ceremonial importance, yet personal insignificance. Her identity, still fragile, began to be defined externally rather than internally. She was to be admired and displayed, yet her thoughts and desires were irrelevant to the men who orchestrated the alliance. Trauma was already taking root, not as a singular event, but as the accumulation of a childhood surrendered to ambition and survival. In these early encounters with dynastic ambition, the girl glimpsed the cruel logic that would dominate her life, that human lives, even the smallest, could be negotiated, measured, and sacrificed for the sake of power. She began to internalize the psychological lessons of observation, patience, and subtlety. She learned that survival required more than obedience. It demanded awareness, restraint, and an ability to conceal fear beneath a veneer of calm. The betrothal was her first initiation into this brutal education, the first encounter with the machinery of a court that demanded sacrifice and exerted influence over bodies and souls alike. By the end of the ceremony, the child, though physically present, had already begun the transformation into a participant in a world that prized power over innocence. Confusion gave way to a nascent understanding of hierarchy, fear to cautious vigilance, and wonder to the sober acknowledgement that her life had been irrevocably altered. The ritual had symbolically transferred control of her body and destiny into the hands of a ruler she would have to navigate with subtlety, intelligence, and resilience. Childhood innocence had been fractured, replaced by the early stirrings of strategy, awareness, and the survival instincts that would define her existence in Castile's unforgiving court. Thus, at the tender age of 7, she confronted the first true horror of dynastic ambition, the surrender of self, the exposure to a world governed by calculation and cruelty, and the stark realization that love, choice, and agency were luxuries denied to her. This was the moment when a child became a symbol, a pawn, and a survivor, stepping unwittingly into a life where trauma, resilience, and the subtle mastery of human observation would be the tools that determined not only survival, but the capacity to endure abandonment, isolation, and betrayal. The journey to the ruler's court was a passage from familiarity into a world both dazzling and merciless. As the child crossed the threshold into this foreign domain, the streets and gates of her new home seemed to pulse with expectation and quiet menace. Castile's court was a realm of gilded splendor, yet beneath its ornate arches and embroidered tapestries lay a network of scrutiny, ambition, and unspoken threat. She was no longer merely a child, she was a stranger, observed, evaluated, and already measured against invisible standards. Every eye, every gesture was part of a larger calculation she could scarcely understand but instinctively felt. Courtiers, trained in the arts of manipulation and influence, regarded her with a mixture of curiosity, suspicion, and opportunism. Every movement was noted, every word passed for meaning. In this environment, etiquette was not a matter of courtesy but a weapon, a form of surveillance disguised as ritual. She learned that posture, tone, and gaze could either attract favor or invite humiliation. The rules were innumerable and often contradictory, a gauntlet designed to test resilience as much as compliance. Each day became a subtle lesson in negotiation, patience, and the silent mastery of perception. The ruler, to whom she had been betrothed, was an imposing figure from the first encounter. His presence commanded obedience. His temper, volatile yet meticulously controlled, instilled unease in even the most seasoned courtiers. He was ruthless in both strategy and demeanor, a man who understood the calculus of fear, loyalty, and control. To him, children were instruments of alliance, their emotions secondary to duty. From the earliest moments, the young bride-to-be learned that charm and innocence offered no protection, that power often spoke in a language of intimidation, and that survival demanded more than compliance. It demanded vigilance. Daily life in this court was a series of tests. Meals, promenades, and lessons became arenas for psychological observation. Servants whispered warnings, nobles offered insincere smiles, even play was laced with instruction and judgment. Each interaction carried layers of expectation and consequence. She learned to anticipate reactions, to observe the undercurrents of rivalry, and to conceal fear behind careful expressions. The small joys of childhood, laughter, freedom, spontaneity, were gradually replaced by calculation, foresight, and subtle strategy. Innocence, once taken for granted, became a fragile mask that required constant adjustment. Her transformation was gradual but inexorable. The first tremors of fear and confusion gave way to a disciplined awareness. She began to catalogue behaviors, who wielded influence, who could be persuaded, and who posed a threat. She observed the ruler's moods with meticulous attention, noting patterns, triggers, and vulnerabilities. Even the smallest smile or frown became data to be stored and analyzed. By the end of her first weeks, the child was no longer merely reacting. She was planning, anticipating, and learning the unspoken laws that governed survival in the court's shadowed halls. Rituals of obedience reinforced the dynamics of power. Bowing, curtsying, and carefully articulated speech were not mere formalities but mechanisms of control. Each action reinforced her subjugation, yet paradoxically it also became a tool for adaptation. She learned that outward compliance could coexist with internal strategy, that humility could be wielded to gather insight, and that patience could be a weapon in disguise. The court taught her that survival was a constant negotiation between vulnerability and observation. Her foreignness heightened her vulnerability. Language, manners, and cultural norms were barriers she had to navigate in addition to political dangers. Courtiers were quick to exploit differences, often turning her origin into a subtle source of ridicule or suspicion. Yet these challenges honed her perceptiveness. She learned to read nuances in speech, to detect concealed intentions, and to discern alliances and rivalries in gestures and glances. The very differences that marked her as an outsider became the lens through which she cultivated understanding and strategy. Isolation compounded the psychological intensity of court life. Friends were scarce, trust even scarcer. Even sympathetic courtiers were constrained by their own ambitions, their loyalty conditional and fragile. She discovered early that vulnerability could be exploited and that expression of fear or anger could be weaponized against her. In response, she cultivated an internal fortress of observation and self-discipline. The child who once acted impulsively learned to restrain her instincts, to weigh every interaction, and to transform fear into knowledge. The ruler's presence remained a constant, imposing reminder of the stakes at hand. His scrutiny was unrelenting, his approval fleeting and conditional. Every glance could carry warning, every word could conceal command. Yet through observation, the young bride began to identify patterns, moments of leniency, the triggers for anger, and the subtle indicators of favor. In these discoveries lay the beginnings of power, not authority, but the capacity to navigate the dangerous currents of influence without falling victim. She learned that comprehension of cruelty could itself be a form of protection, that knowledge of the mind could mitigate the impact of the hand. By the end of her first year at court, she had begun a profound metamorphosis. The naive child, once dependent on comfort and familial reassurance, had become a careful observer, attuned to threat and opportunity alike. Her innocence had not disappeared, but it was tempered by caution and nascent strategy. She had learned to conceal fear behind composure, to convert confusion into insight, and to recognize the patterns that governed life in the court's shadowed halls. The court had captured her physically, socially, and psychologically, yet she was quietly transforming, preparing for the battles, both subtle and overt, that lay ahead. In these early experiences, the child confronted the duality of court life, beauty and terror, ritual and oppression, loyalty and betrayal. Each day was both a test and an education, each encounter a negotiation of survival. She was being forged in the crucible of ambition and cruelty, acquiring skills that would serve her throughout the years of abandonment, manipulation, and danger that awaited. The court had not merely claimed her, it had begun the delicate work of shaping her mind, honing observation, and instilling the resilience necessary to endure and eventually to maneuver within the labyrinth of power. Thus, the young bride's initiation into the ruler's court marked the first true transformation of her life. She was no longer merely a child awaiting her fate. She was an acute observer, a student of human nature, and a nascent strategist. The court, with all its rituals, surveillance, and cruelty, was both prison and classroom, and in its oppressive structure, she learned lessons that would guide every gesture, every thought, and every heartbeat in the years to come. From innocence tempered by fear arose the beginnings of resilience, subtlety, and the capacity to endure a world where power demanded cruelty, and survival depended upon psychological mastery. Life in the ruler's court was a delicate oscillation between indulgence and terror, a world in which a single misstep could mean public humiliation and a fleeting compliment could mask latent threat. For the young bride, this was no longer an occasional encounter with cruelty, it became the rhythm of daily existence. Her days were punctuated by lessons in etiquette, surveillance by eyes that measured compliance, and subtle games of dominance played by courtiers whose motives were inscrutable. In this environment, the ordinary boundaries of childhood were stripped away, leaving her to navigate a realm where fear was the constant instructor and restraint the only armor. Isolation became an ever-present companion. Family visits, when permitted, were brief and carefully monitored. Affectionate gestures were tempered by the understanding that emotional displays could undermine political performance. Friends, scarce and unreliable, often fell victim to the very ambitions that shaped court life. She learned early that trust was fragile and that alliances, even among peers, were conditional. Loneliness pressed upon her, and yet within that isolation lay the seed of resilience. She cultivated an internal space where observation, reflection, and strategic thought could thrive, shielded from the judgmental gaze of the court. The lack of emotional support was compounded by relentless expectations. Every action, every word was scrutinized for political significance. Obedience was demanded not as a form of guidance, but as a matter of survival. Disobedience, however minor, could trigger reprimand, ridicule, or social ostracism. In the midst of this pressure, she learned the subtle codes that governed behavior, when to speak, when to remain silent, and how to mask feelings that could be exploited. The court imposed a curriculum of psychological endurance, shaping her awareness of the intricate balance between visibility and discretion. Episodes of humiliation were frequent, each a calculated lesson in control. Nobles mocked her foreign accent or her timid demeanor, often in the guise of jest or polite correction. Servants, eager to curry favor, sometimes turned minor infractions into public spectacle. Even the ruler, though sometimes distant, could employ subtle intimidation to assert authority, his glances and comments leaving lasting impressions of vulnerability and fear. These moments, though small in isolation, compounded over time, instilling a deep understanding that survival demanded mastery of perception and self-restraint. Threats, both explicit and implied, were woven into the fabric of daily life. A careless word could trigger whispered consequences. A poorly judged gesture might invite scrutiny or reprimand. The young bride learned that danger was rarely overt. It came in the form of social manipulation, calculated omission, and the unpredictable temper of adults wielding power without empathy. Fear became a constant companion, shaping behavior, sharpening instincts, and forcing a precocious understanding of human cruelty. Neglect was another subtle, enduring form of oppression. In moments when guidance should have offered comfort, she often found herself left to her own devices, learning lessons from observation rather than instruction. Tutors might focus on decorum, nobles on display, and the ruler on political advantage, leaving her to reconcile emotional needs with the demands of survival. These absences, while painful, cultivated resourcefulness, prompting her to develop strategies for self-soothing, self-protection, and discreet engagement with the world around her. Yet within this oppressive system, resilience began to emerge. Observation became a tool of power. She could anticipate reactions, detect hidden alliances, and discern rivalries. Secrecy became a shield. Her true feelings, her fears, and even her thoughts were guarded as precious commodities. Subtlety became an art form. Small gestures, measured words, and controlled expressions allowed her to navigate a court where overt defiance could be fatal. The very mechanisms of oppression became the training ground for survival, teaching lessons that would sustain her through greater trials to come. She also learned the economy of patience. Immediate gratification or impulsive response could lead to danger, while careful planning, quiet assessment, and delayed action could yield influence and protection. In a court where power was exercised in invisible currents and sudden shifts, timing was as vital as insight. Each day offered a calculus of risk, which words to speak, which alliances to cultivate, which observations to store for future use. The discipline of endurance, born of necessity, became one of her most potent tools. The young bride's internal world became a refuge and a laboratory. She catalogued the behaviors of adults, analyzed social hierarchies, and tested hypotheses about loyalty, fear, and ambition. Every encounter, however minor, offered data to be remembered and applied. Even the subtle cruelty of peers or the ruler provided insight. She was learning to anticipate threats, to identify patterns, and to convert vulnerability into knowledge. In these moments, resilience was not simply reactionary, it was an active, deliberate cultivation of inner strength. Despite the oppressive environment, glimpses of human connection occasionally pierced the shadows. A kind tutor, a sympathetic courtier, or a fleeting moment of genuine affection reminded her that empathy existed, though it was rare and precious. These moments reinforced the necessity of strategic engagement. They were reminders that alliances and gestures of trust could serve both survival and subtle empowerment. Yet the court's harsh lessons remained dominant, and the young bride internalized the delicate balance between hope and caution, attachment and self-preservation. Over time, the psychological toll became both burdensome and instructive. Fear, isolation, and humiliation were interwoven with moments of observation, subtle triumph, and strategic insight. Her childhood, while constrained and overshadowed by adult agendas, became a formative crucible. The oppressive rhythms of court life, its alternation between indulgence and terror, shaped her mind, sharpened her instincts, and honed her ability to endure. She was learning, in real time, that survival demanded not only intelligence and obedience, but a keen understanding of human cruelty, the capacity for secrecy, and the subtle mastery of perception. In this world, resilience was forged quietly, almost invisibly. Each humiliation endured, each threat navigated, each act of subtle observation contributed to a growing inner arsenal. The young bride understood that control over her environment would never be complete, but mastery over her own response, her poise, her discretion, her ability to learn from every interaction was achievable. In the shadows of Castile's court, she was becoming a student of human nature, a tactician of survival, and a child forced to mature far beyond her years. By the end of this phase of her life, she had internalized the rules of her oppressive environment. Isolation, fear, and humiliation had not broken her. They had taught her to observe carefully, to act with discretion, and to transform adversity into insight. She had begun to navigate the treacherous currents of courtly life with a nascent strategic mind, understanding that survival was as much about patience and subtlety as it was about compliance. Her early lessons in resilience, secrecy, and observation would become essential tools for enduring the betrayals, abandonments, and manipulations that awaited in the coming years.